Good morning, everyone, and welcome to this special legal compliance webinar run on the COVID-safe mandatory vaccination policy requirements. My name is Nihal, Samara. I'm the General Counsel and Legal Director here at Kaizen Synergy Law Firm, and I'd like to welcome you all to today's session. Today's session is really a hands-on session specifically focused on writing a mandatory vaccination policy and some of the specific requirements that your agency needs to consider in writing these documents up. I will cover specifically some of the laws, and we've been going through this over the past few weeks now, and actually unpacking some of the key points that a vaccination policy needs to have. We do have templates that we can supply to agencies. These are just in Word format type of documents, but I'm going to show you some of the really specific things that your agency really needs to be mindful of and look at when having a mandatory vaccination policy, and what essentially this does look like, and what are the really specific items that you actually need to either work through with staff. When I say either, it's not an either or, it's really a decision that needs to be made. But what we have found is the involvement of staff and volunteers in this whole process is something that should be really valued and appreciated as you move through this. And I'll show you what I mean and discuss that a bit more around it. So that said, as always, we'd like to pay our respects to the elders past and present upon the lands on which we all meet. While this session is being run by webinar and recorded, we do pay our respects to the traditional owners where you join us from around the country today. Just by way of introduction as well, our law firm has been involved and been running these webinars, open webinars, since February last year. We have and still are actually involved right down into working with agencies to help set up COVID testing services, vaccination clinics, legal agreements between agencies in delivering COVID-safe works, as well as population health plans and service coordination plans, as well as working with aged care facilities and other agencies around actually not only mandatory reporting, but also some of the policy works that we're going to talk about today. And I only say this not so much to promote the work that we do, but actually to put it into context of saying, look, we're actually across a lot of these areas and some of the challenges that your agency will have in actually putting up a mandatory vaccination policy as well. So let me just jump straight into it. For those of you that have joined us over the past few weeks, some of these slides will actually be quite familiar, but we are going to actually look through and unpack some of these areas and actually focus on some of the key areas that your agency really needs to look at in terms of designing and having a vaccination policy in place. So essentially, I'm going to say this is the main tool or checklist form that we in fact use when working with agencies on designing a mandatory vaccination policy. And these are the questions that we actually ask. And I will come back to this slide around it. But I am going to unpack each of these parts of it because while the state governments and essentially Commonwealth and other, and especially in Victoria where they are launching, I'm going to say, or releasing new mandatory vaccination guidelines, that's fine for certain sectors and industries, and we encourage directions being provided by state and territory governments around this. But essentially what we're finding is that simply to say, yes, you're going to need to have or this sector is covered by vaccination policies, and for example, we've seen that in residential aged care services. What are the issues in terms of interpretation of that particular policy directive itself. So what I mean by that is, what if some employees don't want to be vaccinated? Or what if they have medical reasons for not having the vaccination? How do you then respect people's privacy in that as well too? And can you then have a situation where a staff member says, look, I know Fred is not vaccinated. I don't want to come in because Fred's not vaccinated, or vice versa. So there obviously all of these issues that then come out around actually having a mandatory vaccination policy in the first place. So you need to, as an agency, start to think about, well, how do we actually deal with those? And so we're going to unpack these as well too. I'm going to show you what we've done with other agencies and the likes around this as well too. So essentially, and I'm not going to give you the sort of theory, I want to jump straight into the policy side of it. So essentially, there are mandatory vaccination guidelines being rolled out. We've seen this from the Commonwealth level. In Victoria, they are introducing this week new mandatory vaccination for certain industries and sectors as well. In summary, these are already some of the areas or states of where their positions are at the moment around it. But again, in Victoria, we've seen it where they've previously had the no jab, no job policy position, which was actually introduced very early last year before the COVID works come out. So there is essentially precedent for state governments to actually use previous positions on other types of requirements that they have in place. So essentially, the first thing is, when you look at it from a work health and safety point of view, is can an employer require an employee to be vaccinated? Now, we are seeing places like SPC, Qantas and Virgin quite openly saying that they are going to have, or they've had introducing new mandatory vaccination policies and putting these in place. So essentially, where these are coming from, and we're seeing this change, we actually flagged this early this year, that the state governments would eventually move down this path, and hence the reason that we are running another session next week around this as well too. And over the last couple of weeks, we've been running HR legal updates for these webinars specifically focused on these areas, preempting that Parliament would move across actually introducing a mandatory vaccination policy as well. So essentially, what we are seeing is this position. And let's just go through this, because this is why yourselves have actually joined us today. Essentially, there are some factors you should consider as part of an ongoing basis. And so this is not just about your current looking at a mandatory vaccination policy, but these are the areas that when agencies approach us from a legal point of view, this is what we will actually work through. And I can see some questions coming through. Yes, absolutely, you will get copies of all of these slides, along with a copy of this recording after this session this morning, and this will be made available to you. I will also add that the Ruby and Lynette, who are sitting on the support desk today, will actually reach out to each one of you joining us as well, and look at booking in a time for us to answer any questions that you might have around this, certainly over the next few days this week. So essentially, when we look at this, the first part that we come to is looking at, is there a direction coming out of the Australian Health Protection Principle Committee or state government or territory government around vaccinations for workers in your industry? And that is generally the first position that we have around it. Obviously, if there isn't as yet, I will come to what that looks like and why you may want to consider this. But essentially, that's the first question that we ask. And Alex has just raised a question asking, when will the recording of this webinar be available and sent to all of us? We'll actually do this just after lunchtime today, Alex, and that will be made available ASAP after the webinar, but it will probably be just after lunch around this. And as I mentioned, you'll also get a call from Ruby and Lynette individually, just to make sure that you're supported around that. And if you want to make a time to catch up, over the next few days, including this afternoon, more than happy to do so as well. So essentially the directions around whether there's something that's actually come out from the AHPPC or your relevant state or territory government is essentially the starting point that we start with as well. That said, one of the, and I'll come back to this previous slide, but I'm going to jump back and forth. But sometimes we find that the directions coming out of state and territory governments along with the AHPPC is not actually helpful. While they might provide guidance, it doesn't actually unpack, well, what do we actually need around this? And it essentially having a blanket statement to say that your industry or sector might be covered may not be as helpful as what you think. Because, look, this is one thing that we pulled from the AHPPC website, and they're focused on, one of their positions was focusing on employees in sectors with high mobility, such as aviation, mining resources, freight sector, which they identified pose an increased risk for wide dispersion of infections across long distances and between jurisdictions. So their position is that because of this risk of seeding outbreaks across the country, the AHPPC strongly encourages industries to promote and facilitate vaccination. So that said, where there is that kind of broad statement, it doesn't actually give you a clear position on, well, what do we actually need to do? But essentially it says, okay, look, if we pick that up as an example, great, let's work from here in terms of how we then move forwards. So essentially the policy position that you then have is, okay, yes, you are covered by this, or no, you're not. But then the next question that we look at is, will your workers be exposed to the risk of infection as part of their work? So what we're looking at here is, for example, people that might work in hotel quarantine is an easy example, or those that are at higher risk of exposure when their work duties place them in contact with people who may be infected with COVID-19. So that actually for us obviously includes aged care services as well too. It may be that people are actually traveling into residential homes, or they actually may need to speak to or provide health services support or community services outreach work as well too, and that could include even family violence, domestic violence type of services as well. So you can see that there's a broader risk of infection from those particular groups. The next part that we then look at is, do your workers work with people who would be vulnerable to severe disease if they did contract COVID-19? So again, what we're looking at is, who are the most vulnerable people in the community? And we're starting to see this now in school-age children with the Delta variant as well too. So again, there are people that are more vulnerable than others in the community as well too. The other part that we look at is, what is the likelihood that COVID-19 could spread in the workplace? Examples of that are people that work in close proximity. This includes also even if you did have and you wear masks within your workplace as well too, but essentially people that do work in close proximity is also where you could have the spread of COVID-19 within your community itself as well. The other part that we also look at is, do your workers interact with large number of people in the course of their work that could contribute to a super spreading event if your workers contract COVID-19 as well? And we're just getting questions is, what happens where the people are having rolling vaccinations? And I'll come to that in a minute as well. So essentially, where workers interact with a large number of people in the course of their employment, then again, this adds to the factor of essentially needing a mandatory vaccination policy. And essentially what we're looking at after that is, what other control measures are available and in place in your workplace? Do you have control measures already to minimize the risk of infection so far as reasonably practicable? And this is really from the work health and safety guidelines that your agency needs to look at. So when we unpack this, really what we're looking at is what are the other control measures that you have in place to protect your staff? And some of those, you'll see things like we've spoken about daily attestation registers, screening staff as they come in, or volunteers and the likes, also having QR codes in place to manage your access to different sites as well. All those kinds of things add to making sure that you have a COVID-safe workplace. And the last question that we ask is, would a requirement to be vaccinated be unlawful in certain circumstances? For example, would it discriminate against a class of employees? Now, this is the question that I know that a lot of people are going to have a lot of questions on, and we're going to unpack this last part. So George has just asked, I have a client that works in the welfare industry and is working from home since lockdown and only does administration work with no contact with clients and has been asked to get vaccinated and will be put on annual leave from this Monday. Is this legal? And what can she do? So with it, George, that's a really good question around that. Let me come back to you on this, because there are parts of this that we actually need to unpack around this as well too. And we often find that people ask us questions, essentially, is this legal, yes or no, around it. And this is where we actually do need to unpack some of these questions with you. So that's a really good question. And I'll just repeat that coming back. George has just asked, I have a client that works in the welfare industry and is working from home since lockdown and only does admin work with no contact to clients, and she has been asked to get vaccinated and will be put on annual leave from this Monday. Is this legal? What can she do? So let's actually look at some of these questions, because that does cut across a number of areas that we're going to go through. So essentially, let's one of the questions that people get asked is, what happens if an employee refuses to be vaccinated? So when we look at mandatory policies, there are a number of other questions that also comes out. And this absolutely is one of those questions. So when we look at this, what happens if an employee refuses to be vaccinated? Well, essentially, if the employee has provided a legitimate reason for not being vaccinated, for example, the employee has an existing medical condition that may prevent them from doing so, the employee and the employer should consider whether there are any other options available instead of vaccination. And with it, disciplinary action, whether disciplinary action is reasonable, will depend on circumstances. And these are the individual circumstances that your agency will need to consider as well too. And as part of that, disciplinary action for refusing to be vaccinated has actually strict interpretations from Fair Work. These slides and these works that I'm talking about are actually specifically taken directly from the Fair Work website as well too. What we are going to do is talk over the top of these as well too, and unpack some of these things that you need to consider as well. What Fair Work say in this circumstance is that stand downs are unlikely to be available for employers if an employee refuses a direction to be vaccinated. And employers can only stand down employees in certain circumstances. Now, employers generally don't otherwise have the power to suspend employees without pay unless an enterprise or other registered agreement, award, or employment contract allows them to do so as well too. Now, one of the questions around this that we've actually worked through with agencies when looking at a mandatory vaccination policy is actually have a process for asking the employee to explain their reasons for refusing the vaccination itself. And with that, if an employee refuses to be vaccinated, it may well be what I will say is legally legitimate. So things like if there is an underlying medical condition, if there is certain anti-discrimination reasons as well too, that or categories that the person falls into, and we'll cover what those look like as well too. And again, what is the process of you being able to ask for information as well too. So essentially, at present, assuming there is no public health order, so let's say there isn't any changes to mandatory vaccination positions by various state governments or territory governments or the likes, it is unlikely that an employee could refuse to attend the workplace where a co-worker isn't vaccinated. And this is because vaccinations in some workplaces is not mandatory. And it also may be that the co-worker may have a legitimate reason not to be vaccinated. And that may include, for example, a medical reason as well. Now, whether an employer can take disciplinary action if an employee refuses to be vaccinated is the other part that you need to look at including within your mandatory vaccination policy. And the reason that we say you answer these questions in your mandatory vaccination policy for your agency is to make sure that it is a complete document. We actually advised agencies around not just simply having almost like a yes or no mandatory vaccination policy, but actually spending the time to actually make sure that these questions are actually answered throughout your policy document. So if an employer, can an employee take employer, should I say, take disciplinary action if an employee refuses to get vaccinated? And essentially, an employer may be able to take disciplinary action, including termination of employment against an employee for refusing to be vaccinated if the employee's refusal is in breach of a specific law or clear and repeated lawful and reasonable direction requiring vaccination. Now, whether you can take those steps will depend on a number of specific factors, and some of those are listed here as well too. Now, Fair Work have also advised employers to consider legal advice because of some of the specific nuances that you need to carefully consider around this. Now, as I mentioned, how does a vaccination requirement interact with anti-discrimination laws? And so what we find is that there are protected characteristics that are likely to be relevant in considering whether to require staff to be vaccinated. And that includes whether they have a disability, are pregnant, or for religious beliefs. So this essentially will and can exclude people from actually, even if you had a mandatory vaccination policy, from actually having it. Now, that said, we are aware that advice is for people that are pregnant to actually have the vaccine. We've also been advised on certain circumstances that some people that are pregnant have been advised not to have it, even though they themselves have chosen to have it as well. So there are some anti-discrimination laws that it's not just an automatic exclusion. With consent of people as well too, it means that people can actually still have it, but if they do have one of these protected characteristics, it is important that you carefully consider your mandatory vaccination policy, because you may be in breach of it if you don't consider these particular protected characteristics that people might have. So what we have said to people around this is this, and essentially this is summarizing this down for you. When looking at who your agency provides services to, there are really three main groups that the Australian Technical Advisory Group on Immunisations have advised around this. And essentially where we have focused the mandatory vaccination policy on is to say, does your staff, including volunteers, and also the clients that you provide services to, fit into one or more of these groups? So is it that they have an increased risk of exposure, hence being infected and transmitting COVID-19, to others at risk of a severe disease or in a high transmission setting. This includes people like health and aged care workers, other workers including disability support workers, and other people in other settings where the risk of the virus transmission is increased. It also covers people who are vulnerable as well too from having COVID-19. So that absolutely does include people of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander descent, older people, and people with underlying selected medical conditions. And also those in key occupations as well. Now, this is something that we actually put up a number of months ago around looking at mandatory vaccination policies and also from looking at it from a work health and safety point of view. So when we're looking at it, what your agency needs to carefully look at is what are the services that I'm delivering to clients? What are the impacts of staff providing those services as well too? And can I protect, in all reasonableness, staff, including volunteers who are doing these or providing these services as well? And what other systems do I have in place as well? So generally, we'll actually look at what are those key areas that your agency fits into. So going back to George's question around this and actually asking, do you have specific services that your agency provides services to? What are the vulnerable population groups that you actually need to follow, and where do you provide these services to on these particular requirements? Now, going back to your checklist that I'll show you right at the start around this, essentially it does overlap with what are the directions coming out of the AHPPC. Will your workers be exposed to increased risk? What are the services you're delivering to staff? So answering these questions essentially will prompt you to identify how you should actually frame your mandatory vaccination policy itself, and also looking at the key questions that we've covered off today. Now, picking up George's question around saying, I have a client that works in welfare industry and is working from home since the lockdown and only does administration work with no contact to clients and has been asked to get vaccinated and will be put on annual leave from this Monday. Is this legal to actually do so? Well, there is a number of key things that we need to look at there. Looking at that checklist around it is firstly, why are they being asked to have that vaccine? What are the services that they are delivered as well too? If they are working from home, do they need to have it by Monday, or are they essentially being able to return to work, or will it prevent them from returning to work as well too? Does your agency, looking at the question one, does your agency or is your agency actually covered already by a directions order, or have the state government given some directives that your industry may be covered as well too? And essentially also looking at, well, is there any underlying medical condition or other reason, or are they within a protected category, George, that may also prevent or exclude them from this, that they need to go back to their employer? As I've mentioned, the easiest question is to ask why they haven't actually had it in the first place. And before going down even a legal route, generally we'll actually say to agencies, look, ask your staff these questions around it. Ask your staff around it, because those agencies that have actually done it have actually been quite surprised on what has some of the questions that have actually come back around it as well too. And some staff have even gone so far as saying, look, we are holding out for another, or we've been advised by our medical practitioner to hold out for a specific vaccine. So again, there's a whole range of questions and answers that, there's a whole range of answers that staff and volunteers actually provide around this as well too. But essentially, working through this checklist will give you this very specific questions that you need to look at around this as well too. With it, as I've mentioned from today, review the checklist of where you're sitting. If you have any questions you can reach back out to us. Certainly my mobile number has been made available since February last year, and it's available on Google, so I'm more than happy to circulate that out to everybody today. We will just put that, thanks Ruby, just in, and Lynette, into the chat group as well too, as a direct contact as well. If you do have any questions around this, by all means, you can reach back out to us. I will add that our support desk will reach out to everyone joining us this morning, just to make a time for us to catch up over the next few days, just to answer any questions specifically that you might have for your agency on mandatory vaccination policies and requirements as well. Next week, we are going to be looking at workplace forms, policy, and education programs that you can utilize and roll out to your staff within your agency as well. That said, if there are any questions, more than happy to stay online and answer those now. If you are listening to this and watching this recording after today's live session, and you did want to reach out to us, then by all means, please contact us on 1300 360 360, or you can email us at support@gemba360.com.